Hi, I'm Simone Gower, a graduate student getting my master's in book publishing. This is my podcast, Mental Notes, where I have conversations with authors about mental health representation in young adult novels. In this 6-part series, we'll dive into their real-life experiences with mental health, how it informed the characters in their books, and the insights learned along the way. I hope you enjoy the show, with new episodes coming out every Wednesday. Well, welcome.
Hi.
So I'm so excited to have you. Yeah, I really appreciate you coming on here and being willing to talk. So yeah, really great to have you, JJ.
Awesome. Well, looking forward to it.
Yeah. Well, to get started, do you just kind of want to talk maybe about, I know it's been like a few years since you came out with the duology in general.
Hmm.
And if I remember correctly, Winterson was your first novel that you published. But you just
Yes.
kind of maybe want to talk about what inspired the story.
So this was back in, I guess it must have been 2013. Yeah, it was like 2013. And I was working at a call center at the time for a big soda conglomerate doing their like customer financial services type stuff. Um, I had previously worked in publishing. Actually, I worked in publishing as an editorial in the editorial department, and then I moved to North Carolina with my then boyfriend, now husband, when he got matched for his residency. So I was in a new state, in a job I didn't particularly love. And I just decided to start writing something for NaNoWriMo, which I don't know if you've heard of NaNoWriMo. Okay,
No.
yeah. Yeah, it's National Novel Writing Month, where the goal is to write 50,000 words in 30 days. I had been tinkering with another idea at the time, but it wasn't really working out. And I'd always written for fun, like I'd written fan fiction in high school, and I wrote little stories and scribbled little poems. And so I've always written throughout my career, but I thought this might be the perfect opportunity to try and get a novel that I wanted to get done. This wouldn't have been the first book that I'd ever written, but I was like, oh, I'm going to try this idea. I'd been working on a previous project that really wasn't all that inspiring to me. And so I, for fun, had been emailing a writer friend of mine, Marie Lou, and I just, as a joke, said I was going to write 50 Shades of Labyrinth and make it as fun and trashy as I wanted to, and not worry about whether or not it was good. And so that was really the genesis of Wintersong, and it really to remove the pressure of producing something good, essentially. So I was going to write something that I considered fun and pleasurable and not by any, quote, objective standard good. So that was when I started writing the story. And the idea really came from, I'd been watching a lot of 80s fantasy movies at the time. Aside from the movie Labyrinth, there was Legend. I don't know if you ever saw that or remember that. It's with Tom Cruise and Tim Curry. And so it's just kind of in that sort of fantasy atmosphere. I wanted a book that had that vibe. And then at the same time, I had the idea of a character that was a composer. So all these ingredients sort of came together as kind of the story inspired by Labyrinth and the idea of a female composer set during sort of shortly after the death of Mozart, because I'm a big classical music fan. So that was like another thing that I was throwing into this book. One of my interests that I was going to throw into this book was my love of classical music. So that was Wintersong, which was initially meant to be a standalone novel. And then Wintersong was fairly successful, so my publisher asked if I had an idea for a sequel or a second book, and I said yes, which was only half true. Like, I had a very vague idea of where that story was going to go, but I didn't know any of the specifics. And as I was writing that book, it was the first book that I was writing under contract and to a deadline, as opposed to my first book, which I wrote in full before I sold it. This is the first time I was working towards a deadline. And at that time, I had been diagnosed with bipolar disorder in high school, but at the time I was unmedicated, and I was really struggling with my mental health and everything during that period of time. The stress of having a full-time job and trying to meet my deadlines, and also not knowing what this book was going to be about or where it was going. I knew the ultimate end, but I didn't know how I was going to get there. I essentially wrote that book in a fugue state. But as I I hadn't intended to write my main character, Liesel, as bipolar, but a lot of, because she was a composer and a lot of her creative process of wanting to create music and write music and involved a lot of my own creative processes and a lot of her intense emotionality and her really depressive lows and kind of her manic highs. I didn't intentionally set out to write a bipolar character, but it was just infused with a lot of my own creative process. And so by the time Shadowsong came around, I thought, okay, what if I really look at this in the face and grapple with what it means to be bipolar and to be a creative person and try to find yourself in the world and through your art. And so that was the intention. Again, a lot of the writing process of Shadowsong is out of my brain because it was just very intense, but that's essentially the genesis of those two books.
Yeah. I really just first of all wanted to appreciate just how open you are to talking about your struggle with bipolar and that. But with Liesel, I found it really interesting how whatever state she was in really affected how like her actual ability to compose music and to write music and to actually feel the music like when she was performing it. I thought that was a really, really good representation of what it can be like to kind of, go through like those highs and lows, like you said.
I think a lot of times people think of mania as being, like when you see it portrayed in films or sometimes in other media, you think of mania as being delusional. And they can, obviously, certain manic episodes can feature delusion, but I never really experienced that myself. But the way the thoughts come faster and I have, lived with my bipolar disorder for a long time, and I got medicated in 2020. And was, trying to write books and everything through that entire time. And I described to my therapist once that being manic felt like riding a bicycle downhill. Like you're going really, really fast and it doesn't feel like there's a lot of effort. And I've written books like that. And in retrospect, I feel like I wrote Winterson in a state of mania because I wrote Winterson in less than 60 days. Just boom. The whole book just kind of came out like that. And then I wrote Shadowsong in a period of depression. And it was when I'm depressed, it's not like I'm sad. I was still able to function, kind of survival mode in that regard. But creatively, it was like, okay, I've coasted downhill. And now I have to slowly make my way back up the hill back towards level ground. And that's really what the writing process felt like during the book. And I just wrote, as they say, write what you know. So I wrote that into the second book.
Yeah. And I think that's really kind of apparent obviously intentional in some regard, like in like the tone between the two books. Yeah, with Wintersong being more kind of not exactly upbeat, but a little bit more light kind of in that way, whereas Shadowsong really does kind of really dive into those darker sides, I feel. Yeah. So when you realized that Liesel was bipolar like you, did you have to change like the way that you were approaching like the story? Did you have to actually change like the way that you decided to get to the ending? I guess how exactly did you decide to intentionally incorporate that into the story?
I think some of the intentionality was seeing the effects of bipolar disorder on the people around her, as opposed to it just being a singular thing that only she, you have this sort of myth of the tortured artist that, they're grappling with their mental demons or whatever, and it's just them working through it on their own. But bipolar disorder does affect the people around you, the people that love you and that kind of carry you through all those highs and lows. And, especially with her relationship with her sister and her brother, I thought were very important. And, there was the through line of I had to resolve some of the things that were unresolved from Wintersong. Like she left the underground. So then what is going to be the state of the world if no one is there to bring it back to life? Some of that. And so I thought, okay, this would be an interesting space to explore the otherness of being, of having bipolar disorder, the underground and the wild and the uncanny and the fey and sort of intertwining that with her experience of having a mental disorder. Because what I didn't want to write was what I call an issue book,
Right.
where, the story is essentially still Liesel coming to terms with the ramifications of what she did when she left the underground at the end of Wintersong, and basically how to save the world, what it would take to save the world. So that's still the overall plot of the duology, but I looked for spaces where I could sort of stretch my creative muscles in some ways, or, sort of explore the more metaphorical aspects of what it is to not just have bipolar disorder. I mean, her younger brother is very clearly depressed throughout the book, too.
Mhm.
And he has a connection to the underground. And so I wanted the underground to be a space where not only was it, had not an adverse effect per se, but like a give and take relationship between the underground and the world above, and the sort of constant navigating that you're doing when you do have mental illness or have bipolar disorder. So that was what I did. Was I tried to find places where I tried not to be preachy about it, essentially.
Yeah.
Was what I was trying to do.
Yeah. And I think that you were able to execute that very, very well. Yeah, I really just enjoyed the books in general. I thought your writing was really beautiful and
Oh,
haunting in
thank
this
you.
book. Yeah. You kind of mentioned like the underground and how there's the impact that has on characters like Liesel and Yosef because of their connection with the underground. And one other kind of like imagery that you had like throughout like the book was just like this idea of like mirrors and like the way that um sometimes they'd look into the mirror and they'd be looking at the other world, they'd be like seeing something through, and sometimes they'd be looking at the mirror and seeing themselves, but it wasn't really themselves. Yeah, and just kind of, like the idea of like a mirror and, coming face to face with either who we see ourselves as and whether that's actually like the truth and reality, or maybe it's a more distorted view. Um, I just thought that that was like really, really interesting how you were able to kind of pull that off.
Well, I'm glad you pointed that out because I didn't really think of it that consciously. um, I picked the distorted mirror thing. There's certain myths and stories from different cultures around the world about mirrors, especially mirrors at night, potentially being like a window into another world. And I always thought that was fantastically creepy. So as a child, I used to or like those sleepover games, right? Like where you go
Yeah.
into the dark bathroom and you say Bloody Mary's name like 3 times
Hmm.
and she's supposed to appear. So like as a child, I just didn't want to look at mirrors in the dark at night and I just liked the creepy aspect of it. But the reality distortion part, in addition to me liking the creepy aspect of it, really, I did, again, this didn't happen initially entirely in just the first draft, but in subsequent revisions, as I was trying to strengthen the story, I was trying to pull out various things and I was like, oh, what can I show? And by show, I mean not telling you or just merely describing to you what it's like, but
Hmm.
to try and get the reader to feel what that is like. And I, trying to make that as concrete, despite it being somewhat of an abstract idea, as concrete to the reader as possible.
Yeah. Yeah. Definitely. Kind of switching gears a bit, but you touched a little bit on how this book is a lot more centered on Liesel's relationship with her siblings, more so than like her relationship with the Goblin King. And I I really liked like the sibling focused kind of aspect, but you also mentioned how, a character like Liesel, somebody living with mental illness, or like the tortured artist, they're not just isolated necessarily. Their actions do have impacts on people. And I think it's just kind of saying that we as people, we don't live in a vacuum, right? Like even if, we feel like we're alone, or we maybe feel like we want to isolate ourselves in order to not hurt other people, that still is affecting other people. I think that there are moments in the book where Liesel kind of maybe has that too, where she maybe thinks that she's being too selfish, or she's like trying not to be selfish. Not that she is selfish, but I'm getting all mixed up here. But where, you're trying to do like the right thing to not hurt other people, but then that's still kind of having a negative effect on people. But that's also just a part of being human. Although I do kind of feel as though like mental illness can make it harder to almost see like the clarity in the way that what we do can affect people sometimes.
Yeah, there's a scene where Keita, her sister, kind of says, you're like a top that I'm always watching to see if it will spin out of control.
Mhm.
I have a lot of fondness for her sister, because in Winter Song, she's kind of initially portrayed as this sort of like kind of flighty, you
Yeah.
know, sort of shallow kind of a person, but she's not. There's a lot of strength in her
Mhm.
sister. And I know this feeling particularly in my own family growing up, feeling like I was this almost like an unstoppable force on my family. And they had always been incredibly supportive, actually. Like my mother was one of the first people to, when I told her I think I need help, she made sure, to take me to various therapists and psychiatrists and, trying to figure out what was happening with me. And she'd always been supportive. In fact, when I told you I was really struggling with writing Shadowsong, I was juggling a full-time job. I'd moved out of the phone center by that time, and I was in a different kind of day job, again, working more in the financial side of things. And I really felt like I couldn't handle it. And I remember calling my mother and just being like, why can't I do this? And she was like, just quit your job. Financially, I needed this job. And I was like, I was expecting some royalties to come in. So, those could but kind of in between, you only get paid twice a year for royalties in publishing. So but she basically encouraged me, she's like, just quit your job. Ultimately, you can always get another job if you need one, but this is something you need to do, then quit your job. I will help you financially. And my parents did help me financially. So, I was never alone as well. I've always had a loving, supportive family around me. And I've always considered myself, and I've always been very open about the fact that I've had very good support throughout my whole life. It didn't mean that my experience of my bipolar disorder was any easier per se, because it's
Right.
still, intense, highs and lows and all those sorts of things. But it wasn't made any more difficult by my own family.
That's good. I'm really glad that you had that support in them. So, yeah. I have I was diagnosed with borderline personality disorder.
Hmm.
So, I think of it kind of like a cousin a little bit
Yes.
to
Yeah.
bipolar. A little bit not quite as longer periods of time with the, episodes and switches, but um yeah, with having a good support system definitely helps. My own understanding and everything, but it's like I'm still struggling in the same ways that like I would be if I didn't have the support system too. So it's nice to be able to have family or friends who can at least recognize that you're struggling and stay with you through it, even when you might hurt them somehow or just it's not when you're struggling, it's not fun for you, but it's also not really fun for other people to be around you, to be completely honest in some ways. So the fact that you had a support system and I've had a support system too, that people still kind of will stick by you is always a blessing.
Think too, love is incredibly important. That was partially the reason I wanted to focus on Liesel's family more than the romance. I know some of my readers were slightly disappointed, I think, about the diminished appearance of the Goblin King. But for me, those books were never really about the romance. They were a coming of age story. Like Liesel is trying to figure out who she is and who she is in the world. And I think that is part of growing up. And romance is a part of that. Romance certainly helps you figure out who you are, but that wasn't the end in and of itself, even
Mhm.
though there is a happy ending, spoiler alert, but that was never the most important part of those books for me. But that love in general is crucial, not only the love that Liesel has for those around her, but the love that she receives. And sometimes I
Yes.
think when you are struggling with, bipolar disorder or borderline personality disorder, any of those sorts of things, you feel like you don't deserve it. You feel like you
Mhm.
don't deserve people's grace. You don't deserve people's empathy or anything like that. But it's not a matter of whether or not you deserve it. It's the fact that love exists and it exists between you. And if my friends were going through trouble, I would also, do my best to love them and to help them through that. It has nothing to do with, it's me being bipolar is just another part of who I am, right? It's not the defining feature of who I am. I'm other things besides my bipolar disorder. And, I wanted to make that clear as well, that Liesel was more than just her bipolar disorder is she had hopes and dreams, and she was, her biggest thing is that she wanted to write music, and that,
Mhm.
is the thing that drives her. So, I wanted to show somebody who's struggling with it, but also was a person beyond that.
Yeah. Yeah, I know in the book, I'm assuming it's more so because of the time period that the book takes place in, but throughout the book, you kind of refer to mental illness in a way as madness or just anything kind of dealing with that in general. That word just kind of comes up with madness. And I remember one of the quotes where Liesel is talking to her grandmother, I think, and she says that madness is not a gift. And then her grandmother says, nor is it a curse. It simply is.
Yeah.
And that kind of just, reminds me that it's, well, mental illness and, having these kinds of struggles isn't necessarily a good thing. It's also just a fact of life. Like it is. It doesn't make you any less of a person.
Yeah, I also wanted, the quote theme of madness in the story is also, it's clear that her grandmother is also, bipolar or, depressed or had some other mental illness. And it does run in families. And I wanted to
Hmm.
make that clear as well. It's not an isolated thing, and it's not something that is necessarily your fault. We think like if you get sick, that's your fault if you didn't take care of yourself. But, when you have mental illness, it is just a part of who you are. It's,
Yes.
often you're born with it. And to have that in her family, and not just her grandmother, but her brother. And obviously there's her mother and her sister who clearly don't suffer from mental illness, but her father did. I wanted to make that, and you could see the effects too, because this takes place in the late 1700s, early 1800s. So they didn't have obviously the vocabulary we do now for these sorts of diagnoses. But you can see the effects too that sort of unregulated or misunderstood mental illness had. Liesel's father was an alcoholic. And sorry, if you hear growling or barking, those are my dogs. I have two dogs. The sort of, the effects that it has on the people around them again, but where Liesel was able to, thrive in many ways is because she had love around her, whereas I don't think that previous generations of her family did. They didn't have understanding in that way.
Yeah, yeah. I feel like you are also kind of like touching on almost like a reflection of how things seem today in our society too, where it seems like younger generations are more open to uh, accepting, maybe even just talking about, struggles in general, but especially with mental health. I don't necessarily want to stereotype entire generations, but it tends to be that a lot of people in older generations maybe didn't talk, about that sort of thing as much, or maybe it was more of a taboo subject. But then as you kind of go down the line, I feel like there's more acceptance and more openness to being vulnerable in that way.
Yeah, there's definitely more normalization. I'm 40, so I remember when it really wasn't so openly talked about either. I do credit my mother, very much because, looking back at my own family history, when I was first getting diagnosed and I was, seeing various psychiatrists, they'd ask, "Is there a family history?" I didn't really know that, when I was in high school. But my grandfather had bipolar disorder, most likely. Obviously, wasn't diagnosed in his day either. And my uncle as well. I always knew my uncle passed when I was pretty young. He's 15 years older than my mother, and he died in a car accident. But he'd sort of always been kind of troubled, as they would say, right? He
Hmm.
was an alcoholic, he had emotional regulation issues. He was an addict in many ways. So I knew that about my uncle. And I think my mother saw both her father and her brother suffer this and just thought, I don't want my own child to suffer this either. So I do credit her a lot. And I think, even as I've gotten older, it was slightly less taboo to talk about mental health things, when I was younger. But, especially, as I said, I'm 40. So just in the past 20 years, you see a lot more normalization of people talking about and being more vulnerable and, just saying this is, in many ways, you're like living with a chronic illness, right?
Yes.
This is a condition that is manageable, with, certain therapies, like talk therapies and medications and everything like that. But it's a chronic condition that is to be managed.
Mm.
in that way.
Yeah.
If you want to look at it clinically.
Yeah. Yeah. Or I always think, your brain is an organ too, right?
Yeah.
And your mind is in your brain. So yeah, if there's something, if, something's maybe not the way that it should be in your mind, then you gotta, figure out a way to kind of work through that and, treat that the same as you would with any other issue that you're having in your body too. So going back and talking about Yosef. So Yosef, unlike Liesel, doesn't seem to really like exhibit like the same, exactly like highs and lows. From my perspective, Yosef came across as a character who's just very depressed. Is that
Yes.
kind of how you intended to write
Yes.
him? Yep.
Yeah. There's obviously you could look at it as quote problematic as me sort of using the underground and supernatural or otherworldly creatures in the world as being an extended metaphor for mental illness. But for Yosef, I wanted to really hone in on the feeling of otherness, that he never felt quite like he fit in or belonged with, spoiler alert, Yosef is a changeling. He grew up in the human world, but he's not human. And depression is not just an innate condition, it could be situational. And for Yosef, it
Right.
is also situational. He's been ripped away from the place that he thought that he felt safe. He felt safe with his sister, and he felt safe close to the Goblin Grove. He felt safe close to home. And now he's out in the world and away from the things that he considered safe. And so it makes his depression worse. Right? That was kind of the thing about Yosef that I really wanted to highlight, and that, the underground is not just a metaphor for solely bipolar disorder, obviously. It's, a
Mm-hmm.
various spectrum of mental illnesses kind of represented. And I wanted to sort of, Yosef's acceptance of who he is to help him come to terms with his depression as well. When he finally finds out the truth of what he is, it gives him a sort of more objective, understanding of, oh, this is why I felt this way, and that's kind of what I felt in many ways when I got my own diagnosis. I was like,
Yeah.
this is why I felt this way. I also have ADHD, and I was diagnosed fairly late with ADHD. And when I got that diagnosis, I was like, so many more things make more sense now.
But yeah, just that having that understanding or clarity of why you are the way that you are, maybe why you feel the way that you do, can just kind of bring a little bit more peace of mind, I feel. And with Yosef being so young too, like these characters, they're pretty young. Like even though they
Yeah.
lived in a different time period where, they in a sense became an adult sooner than we would be like considered an adult today. They're still young. And I think with writing, characters like that age and then like teenagers who are like reading these stories can like see themselves in that. And with Yosef, it's like you said, like he was kind of um, torn away from everything that he knew, that he was familiar with. He had like this really high expectation put on him that I feel like a lot of teens can probably relate to in some way, especially with, the idea of an expectation not really being what you want or just feeling trapped almost and overwhelmed, but at the same time, not having a lot of agency to do anything about it just because of their age, right? Like they really remove themselves from a situation because they have to go to school and they live with their parents.
Yeah, at that age, the concept of teenagerhood didn't really come about, I think, until even childhood didn't really come about until, like, I believe the Victorian era, and the idea of adolescence as being a distinct period of time in your life as well is also a fairly new idea. They would have been pretty much adultified from a young age in the late 1700s. Um, I knew a lot of people. I did okay when I went to college. I didn't do nearly as well in school as I did when I had routine around me. But I knew a lot of my friends who, once they left home, were struggling. That,
Mm-hmm.
and the other thing is, they felt like they should be grateful for everything that they had too. That sort of self-loathing that came with this idea of, I should be grateful. This is a great opportunity for me. I'm where I wanted to be. Why can't I feel happy about this? Why can't I, and I saw that, and I, thought, yeah, I feel like someone like Joseph would probably encounter that as well. He this is something that his family expected him. It's a great opportunity. He is a violin prodigy, and he's training with this great violin master. And there's a lot riding on him. He's supposed to bring the family money to lift him out of poverty. And, a lot of my friends are immigrant children, often the first of their generation, first in their family at all to go to college. And there's a lot of that expectation placed on them too, to, help the family out. It's not just to help them out, but they felt this responsibility to their own family, and I saw a lot of them really, really struggle with that. And so that was part of when I wrote Yosef. I was thinking of them as well.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a really interesting perspective too that I hadn't thought of with being yeah, an immigrant and just kind of that burden on a shoulder. Um I guess, the word that I just keep saying, actions
Yeah.
of, being the first. Yeah, just have a lot riding on that. Definitely. And then, being a perfectionist too, I feel like a lot of people can kind of relate to wanting to, you know, not necessarily like be the best in the world, but always do their best, always has to be um, you know, perfect in every way that they can be in order to um please other people and fulfill those expectations, even if they're somewhat unrealistic too. You feel like you always kind of have to be on.
Yeah. I think it's the perfectionism is, you talk about expectations placed upon you, but there's just expectations that you place upon yourself. And that's the thing about perfectionism, is that it's like an ever-moving target for yourself as well. It's not just an external standard you're trying to meet. It's a standard that you've set for yourself that, you may never be able to reach. Or even if you did, it probably won't bring you the satisfaction or the sense of accomplishment that you thought it would.
That's very true. Yeah, I feel like especially when I was in high school and at least early college, maybe not so much my later years of undergrad, but just something as simple as grades, it's like could get an A, and to me that still wouldn't be good enough because I didn't get an A plus, I didn't get a perfect.
Yeah. Well, when you grow up with an Asian mother, if you got an A minus, that's like an Asian B, as they say. My parents never actually, again, in many ways, my mother broke the cycle of a lot of things from her own life. Yes, she did expect very high performance from me, but she never actually did ride me all that hard if I got the occasional A minus, or anything like that.
That's always good. It's
Yeah.
good. Another thought that Liesel has to come to terms with by the end of the story is like this idea of who she is, right? I think there's a quote where she says like she's talking to herself in a sense and is saying, I am Liesel, I'm composer, I'm this, I'm that, I'm Liesel entire. She's saying like the good things about herself, but also, talking about maybe the things that like aren't so good too, but accepting like all parts of herself and yeah, coming to terms with that I really enjoyed like seeing her throughout like the story, accepting all of those pieces to herself and kind of realizing that she was changed by the underground and that's okay too, as she had to like kind of like rediscover that and who she was, but she did find that out.
That was the whole, Liesel entire was. So I'm now how many books into this process? 6 books into this whole publishing process. And writing each book, the experience of writing each book has been very different. From book to book, it will change. And each one, I discover something new about myself that I need. The frustrating thing about writing a book is that you're never writing the same book over again. So you're essentially having to learn a whole bunch of new skills to tackle with whatever story you're trying to write next. But I did discover fairly early on about myself that I couldn't write anything. I couldn't write something if I didn't have something to say, or what I call the point. Like, what is the point of what I'm trying to write? For me, it was not enough just to have a simple, entertaining story. I don't read that way either. When I read books, I tend to look for what I call the point. Like, what is the text trying to say? What's the point that it's trying to make? And I do need that before I write, before I have an idea of what I'm writing. I didn't realize the point, of accepting who you are entire until very late in the writing of Winterson. And then I had to go back and then sort of add all the parts and strengthen all the parts that sort of helped with that point that I was trying to make. But I also think that That's a realization you have to come to as you grow up, right? I love coming of age stories. One of my favorites, for all its problematic aspects, was Peter Pan when I was young. The idea of growing up requiring a different understanding or a perspective, and there's always some sort of change or transformation in the character as they are growing up, right? Yeah. Or his Dark Materials, that one in that series, the concept of growing up is literalized in your demon, this external manifestation of your soul when you're a child changes shape. But when you grow up, or you go through puberty, but just really when you grow up, it becomes fixed. It no longer changes shape. And the metaphor is that you've kind of discovered who you are at that point, and so your demon doesn't need to change anymore. And so I've always loved these coming of age stories. And so for me, that was really what I wanted this duology to be about, was my thoughts about what it means to grow up, which is to accept all parts of who you are, right? It's, the good and the bad. And it doesn't mean, your flaws doesn't make you a bad person. It's just part of the whole picture.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that especially for young adults, that's a really important lesson that, everybody inevitably has to learn it at some point. But, being able to have books where they can see characters like themselves, they can see good characters who have flaws, and they accept themselves, I think is really helpful in the readers actually being able to accept themselves as well. And yeah, that's just one of the things that I really love about young adult books in general. Yeah,
there are multiple reasons. I've only written young adult books so far, or I've only published young adult books so far. And every once in a while I get questions, are you going to ever write an adult book? I'm never going to say never, but the honest truth is I like writing for young people. Remember very vividly what it was like to be a young person myself. So a lot of those feelings and experiences are in the books that I write. Also, adults are kind of boring. By the time you get to adulthood, you've got bills to worry about and kind of adult things to worry about. There's so much possibility when you're young. And I think I like writing about that the future is still wide open to you. And to give young people hope about what they can become, I think is really why I like young adult fiction. I do Taekwondo. I am the oldest person in my, quote, adult class. Most of them are teenagers, around 12 to 14. And they're all black belts and everything like that. But one of my favorite things to do is just to talk to them. I love talking to them. They're so funny, and I actually really love the middle school age. I know that's everyone else's least favorite part, but middle schoolers, there's something to me incredibly sweet and wholesome and pure about the fact that they're essentially still children, but they are coming upon this, a new understanding of the world, but they don't quite understand it yet, but their perception is broadening, and they're still a child emotionally, and there's this very awkward, really sweet period of time, and I think it's cute. So I have a lot of affection for teenagers.
Yeah, I agree with you there. I think there's just something, especially with middle school age, there's just something really endearing about them, and the way that they kind of experience the world too. But yeah, I guess in writing these books, you've said that each time you write a book, you discover something new about yourself, right? In writing these characters. How much of you writing a story is you writing it for yourself versus you trying to write it for your audience?
I always write the first draft. I'll put it this way. The first draft is always for me. If I'm not entertained, if I don't want to know what happens next, then how could I possibly expect anyone else to care? So it's always for me in the first draft. In subsequent drafts, I do think about who the reader is. I imagine a reader, someone, like me, or, is dealing with certain issues, or is curious about a particular thing, or I imagine a reader when I am revising the story, because at that point I've clarified to myself what I want to say. So what's the point of having something to say if you have no one to say it to? But the first draft is always for me, right? Even if something of mine never gets published, at least I wrote something that I wanted to read. That's kind of the way I think about it.
Yeah. Yeah, I really love that. So at the beginning of your story, you had your author's note, in which was kind of like a content warning or trigger warning. How do you decide to I guess how did you decide to put that in your book and include that, and why do you think that that was important to do?
Because, the process of writing Shadowsong was just a really rough time for me mentally. And I think I wanted to warn people, that it could be a rough time, if they weren't prepared for and also because tonally, Shadowsong is in many ways a lot darker than Wintersong. If
Yes.
I wanted to set the expectations in the right place. Because if you're going into the second book expecting more romance, that's not what Shadowsong is about. And I really wanted to set that expectation. No, this grapples with darker themes. Suicidal ideation, bipolar disorder, addiction, all those sorts of things that if I wanted people to understand what they were going into, that I wasn't doing this for shock value, that I was doing this because I needed to explore this part of that story, and this is where the story needed to go. So it really was, in many ways, to properly set the reader in the right place, in the right mind frame. I do believe in trigger warnings. I think that they're very important for people who can be triggered by, things that you don't think about either. Triggers can be unexpected. I have a friend of mine who suffers from CPTSD, and when she gets triggered by things, I'm always like, oh, so that, I understand, the effects of that on a person. And I don't want to unintentionally cause harm by, what I was trying to explore in my books. I know a lot of people don't like trigger warnings because they think it's spoilery or they think it's, I don't know, there are many reasons, I guess, people don't like them. And it's funny because, Shadowsong came out in 2018. So this is sort of a bit before trigger warnings were kind of more commonly accepted in books. I think that it's another thing that I think it's good that we've sort of normalized and talk about in fiction. But it really came from a place of I didn't want to cause any extra, and I wanted to make sure the reader was in the right mind frame to experience the story as I'd written it.
Yeah, I think you also made a good point with saying being in the right mind frame, especially because this isn't an issue book, right? Like if you're reading an issue book, a book that is specifically about a character with mental illness, and that is like their story in the book, you kind of have an idea of what to expect going into it. And it's easier from before you started reading the book to kind of prepare yourself mentally for that, or get yourself like in the
Yeah.
right mindset to potentially read something that, you know, could, trigger you, or just make you just not feel in a great mood, and you're kind of able to prepare yourself. But with a book like Shadowsong, where like you said, it's not an issue book, it's more like incidental, even
Yeah.
though it is still very focused on Liesel and just kind of the idea of mental health. But, there's a different plot that's going on too. I think that having a trigger warning, like you said, just preparing your readers that this is what this book is going to also deal with. I think that's really helpful.
I do think, trigger warnings aside, I do think setting proper expectations for the reader is important, no matter the genre or the book or anything like that, Even on a more superficial level, when you expect, like, say you pick up a book expecting a mystery and it turns out to be, some sort of rom-com, it's not necessarily a bad thing per se, but you had different expectations of what this was going to be.
Yeah.
And I do think setting reader expectations is something that I think maybe we should be more conscious of in publishing in general. Whereas I think a lot of times people sort of just focus on the external shiny things that might appeal to people. But there are plenty of times when I've read a book and I've been disappointed. Not because the book was bad, but because my expectations were just not properly set up before I read the book. And then if I reread it with the proper expectations in mind, I have a much better experience of it.
Yes, definitely. I've also been there where I've read a book and, thought at the end, I'm like, this is not what I thought this book was going to be, what it was going to be about. Or, that's happened with movies too. You
Yes.
go in to a movie thinking it's going to be one thing, and it's
the
something
trailer
different.
is cut one way, and then you go and you see the movie, and this is not at all what the trailer said it was going to be.
Yes.
That kind of thing.
Yeah. I do think that it worked. I think that it was a good idea to put that in Shadowsong too.
Yeah, I do think that having trigger warnings normalized is definitely a good thing, even if they're not in the text themselves. I try to make content warnings for each of my published books and put them on my website just, for people who are curious or may need. My next series is a little bit younger in terms of audience, and they're much more lighthearted than Winterson and Shadowsong. But they deal with some heavy topics of oppression and parental abuse and, genocide even. So I wanted to make people aware that those were things that were in there that, if it was triggering to them, that some of those were being touched on in those stories.
Yeah, I think even from, like a parent perspective, if like they're, trying to buy like a book for their child, I feel like that would be helpful too. Just knowing like what they're giving their child and what kind of they want them to read, or even if they know their child and they know what their child would want to read. Like I essentially nannied for this family for like a decade, and one of the boys is a really avid reader. He loves to read, but he gets like night terrors, and when there's like a lot of like vivid, like imagery, that sort of thing, it really sticks in his mind. So his mom is like and he loves to read kind of like above his age a little bit. But his mom has been like very good at like, helping kind of like curate those books and be like, okay, like maybe like skip this chapter or something. And I think that even just something as simple as a trigger warning or a content warning can even be helpful in ways like that. I guess if there's anything that I have not brought up that you would love to touch on or kind of delve into.
No, I think we covered, a lot of the things. I haven't really talked this in depth about my books. A lot of the times, a lot of the questions I get are often about the romantic aspects of the book. And again, for me, it was never the point. Also, I'm not very good at romance. So it always surprises me when people are like really fascinated by this, or, it's kind of nice to talk about the other aspects of the book that were very important to me when I was writing them, and I also have, really have to credit my editor too, because one of the first drafts of Shadowsong I was really struggling with because of those outside expectations that I was like, I have to make this book as romantic as the first one. And I think my editor in one of those phone calls, when I was basically having a meltdown to her about it, and she was like, you don't have to write Winterson all over again. And I was like, and that really freed me to really follow the story where it needed to go, as opposed to feeling like I needed to stick to, what I thought audience expectations were going to be for a sequel to this sort of book. I think I answered all the world building questions, what happens to the world, how do you bring balance back, all those sorts of things. And I think it is a happy ending, as bittersweet as it might be. I cried while I was writing. Again, Yosef is very, very near and dear to me. I have one younger brother. He's actually 10 and a half years younger than I am. But so I really love writing about sibling relationships, because I think that it's just as important as romantic love to show love in other forms, right? You have Keta and Yosef around Liesel, and they're just as important to her as, this mysterious Goblin King that she left behind. It's not that she abandons her family to chase romantic love. I don't think that's not important to me. So, I didn't want to make it important to my characters either. So it's nice to talk about other themes in the book.
Yeah, definitely. And I feel, while there, still is romance, and while you still can have romance, you said this, earlier on in our chat here, but how just love in general, or just, your family relationships, your platonic relationships, like, are just as important too, and that it's romantic love is the end all be all, for that's, what's gonna, save you, or, make you better, sort of thing. And it's really just kind of love in general. And the love that you feel, the love that you receive, that's kind of how we, are able to survive, really, and connect as humans.
Yeah. It's a very sort of, not naive. I don't want to say it's very idealistic, I suppose, to say that love is really what's going to solve things. But I genuinely do believe that. Maybe that is why I write for younger people, because, I am very idealistic in that way as well. I've never lost that idealism part of me. So,
That's always good, though. Great. Well, anything else that you'd like to add?
no, this was a great conversation. Really, thank you very much for this opportunity.
Yeah, thank you so much for coming on again. I really, really appreciated your time. I've loved chatting with you and just getting
Yes.
to do this. So, well, it was wonderful having you on, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.
All right, you too.
All right, bye.
Bye.
If you or a loved one is affected by anything discussed in this episode or struggling with mental health in general, know there is always help. You can call or text the National Suicide and Crisis Lifeline at 988 or visit 988lifeline.org. For the National Alliance on Mental Illness Helpline, call 1-800-950-NAMI or visit nami.org. You can also download the Not Okay app at notokayapp.com. The app will notify your trusted contacts in case of a crisis.